So what I'd like to speak of today is really the source or the origin of the Midas Hadin and the Midas Rachamim. Especially the Midas Rachamim, where does it come from? And why do I say that? Because the truth is, in order to understand, the Midas Hadin really represents a certain emes. And the emes has to do with the fact, the fundamental principle, that two subjects cannot coexist. That because both have a centrality, one has a relative transparency, which is the Zulosoi, and one has an absolute centrality, which is Atzmusoi. They can't coexist, and therefore there's a yichud pressure. There's a yichud pressure that comes from the Rabbi Shalom, that comes from the Rabbi Shalom, that it doesn't tolerate a breach to his fundamental characteristic of Einoid Mavadoi or Einoid. In other words, the Rabbi Shalom cannot tolerate something which is outside or attempts to be outside of himself. Because fundamentally, there's one characteristic that he has in his fundamental personality, if I may call it up. And this is, most people don't think of it this way. The Rabbi Shalom is absolutely alone. That's right. He has the quality of being alone, not as only is he alone because he's the only one of his kind, so to speak. But his natural state is to be alone. Why is that? That's because he doesn't have anything outside of him. So something which is not outside does not exist outside. The Rabbi Shalom exists as he is by himself because of his self-awareness. And his self-awareness is identical to himself. So therefore, it's his truth that he can only exist alone, and he only exists alone as a natural state. The Rabbi Shalom cannot exist in a process called together. There's no such thing in the concept of together. The Rabbi Shalom cannot exist together with another entity or another subject. So therefore, his natural state is to be alone, and he must be alone. I mean, in his existence. So some people sometimes ask me, is the Rabbi Shalom lonely, or did the Rabbi Shalom create reality to have company or something like that? Does he need anything else? Like I think the Rabbi Vitala says in the Yitzchayim that the Rabbi Shalom wanted to create subjects to his kingdom because he's a melech, he's a king. But in order to be a king, you need a malchus, you need a kingdom. So that's like one kind of apparent reason. Or the Rabbi Vital says the Rabbi Shalom is a lachem v'chanan, but he has to exhibit this trait in actual performance. So that's why he had to create beings which require lachem v'chanan. Well, these are cute statements, but I don't believe that these statements have anything to do with the truth, because the Rabbi Shalom does not require anything together or another being whatsoever. In fact, the Rabbi Shalom does not only require it, does not require it. The Rabbi Shalom cannot tolerate it, because his being is defined as being absolutely alone, in the sense that Einoid, there is no one but him, and there cannot be anyone but him. Since his existence emanates from him, he is synonymous with his existence. And existence really is not even real. There's no such thing as existence. There's no such thing as a process which is shared by different entities together, called existence, that allows them all to be. So there's no such thing as existence as such. Existence is a highly personal and individual affair And since it's synonymous with God himself, it only belongs to him, and it's only exhibited in him. So therefore, he can have nothing else which shares existence at all, because it's not a process outside of him, it's a process inside of him. So therefore, by definition, Atzmusai will always be alone. It's an aberration for Atzmusai to share his existence with something else. That's actually a complete aberration, and it's impossible. So like I've said, when you say Hashem Echad, he's really not one, because one is a number which implies two. And when you say the Rebbeinu Shem is one, it's not a number which is possible to imply two. You know what I mean? He's not part of a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4 at all. But that's the only way we can understand it. So what Echad really means is not the number one. Echad means unique, totally unique. And the uniqueness of the Rebbeinu Shalom lies in the fact that he is alone, he will always be alone, and so on. So this is what we're talking about. So therefore, anything which competes with him, anything which attempts to be besides him in a condition called together, generates a yichud pressure from his being, and that yichud pressure causes him to annihilate whoever that is. So therefore, the whole creation requires the concept of harmonization. When the Rebbeinu Shem created the Zoroastrianism, which is also a subject, in a sense, there's something about the centrality, the fact that Zoroastrianism creates, existence emanates from the Zoroastrianism also. Why? Because the essence of the Zoroastrianism is consciousness. And the essence of consciousness is self-awareness. Consciousness is nothing more but than self-awareness, which means that the Zoroastrianism knows that he is by himself. He has what's called a core, and that core is somewhat, appears to be individuated in the Zoroastrianism. It really only belongs to him. And everything in the universe, everything in existence is outside of that consciousness. So he also has a property of centrality. And that property of centrality makes him a subject. The fact that he knows that he exists by himself. But more than that, he knows that he exists not only by himself, but through himself. That's the real way to say it. The Zoroastrianism knows that he is by himself. He doesn't require any other process to tell him that exists. His process is him, in a sense that it's synonymous with his self-awareness also. So it's also through him. And this is a very deep thing. There's no such thing as existence itself. It's not a process. It's not something which is attached to the Zoroastrianism, to the essence of the Zoroastrianism outside of him. You see it? It is in his mind. It's the core of his consciousness. It says, I am. So therefore, the Zoroastrianism is therefore like a subject. And in the sense that it's like a subject, it cannot coexist with the ultimate being, God, who says, I am also. And both of them cannot say, I am. They cannot say it together. Because that's true of only one of them, God. God makes the statement, I am. But in his statement, I am alone and will forever be alone. I am does not share my being with anything else, because my being is not something that I have. It's not something that I own. It's something that I am. I am is me. And therefore there's nothing that can be outside of me. So therefore, it will cancel the Zolosoi automatically, because the Zolosoi in some way has also an attempt to say, I am. To myself, I am also. So therefore, this is a contradiction. This is a contradiction of two forces. And this means that the force in the Rebbeinu Shalom, called the Yichud pressure, will cancel anything that says I am. Of course, if you don't say I am, you're an object. And that the Rebbeinu Shalom does not cancel that, because that doesn't have a mind, it doesn't have consciousness. Even the consciousness of an animal, the consciousness of a cat, is not true consciousness, because even though a cat feels, in a certain sense, something like his existence, this existence that he feels is only part of his reality. It's given to him outside of him in a way. But the existence of the Zolosoi comes from the self, S-E-L-F, the self, which fundamentally is synonymous with the Zolosoi. The Zolosoi is nothing more than pure consciousness. It is not physical, it is not spiritual. So therefore the Zolosoi is not a body, is not a soul. These body and soul is simply lenses which indicate something about the reality of objects. But they have nothing to do with the ultimate existence, which is pure consciousness and which says I am. So we see fundamentally, I've tried to summarize the fundamental problem in the Zolosoi. And this problem of the fact that two subjects cannot coexist is what creates the Midas Hadin. First of all, what it creates is the necessity to harmonize, because the Zolosoi cannot coexist with God. So therefore, it has an obligation to somehow harmonize with God. And the question is, how can it do that? Well, it can do that. How? Fundamentally, it's only one way, by recognizing that even though I feel that I am me, what the Zolosoi says is, I am me. That automatically means that the Zolosoi will see God as I am me, and therefore you are you. The Zolosoi sees God as a me-you duality, which of course is absolutely false. But the Zolosoi cannot help this issue. It has to see everything as a you. So the fact that it sees everything as a you is part and parcel of the fact that it sees itself as a me. And this is a false view. So this creates the contradiction between the Zolosoi and Atzmusoi, or the Zolosoi and the Ein Sof, at the lower level of being a Malbush. So therefore, the Zolosoi is obligated to harmonize with God. And how does it do that? Because it cannot transcend that it sees God as a you. It cannot transcend that. Because as long as it sees itself as a me, it sees anything else as a you. And this definitely applies to God. And this, of course, antagonizes the yichud pressure of God himself. So how does it harmonize? Well, it only harmonizes by the fact that it can love God. Because God says to the Zolosoi, you think that I'm outside of you. I'm not. I am you. I'm inside of you. You come from me. You know, I created you in a certain sense, or really I derived you from me. And you share in my ability to be conscious in a certain sense, in a certain way, which is beyond comprehension. God allowed you to share in his consciousness, you know, as best as you can. And the fact that you share his consciousness in a certain way is what he derived. So God never created you in such. God simply derived you as an entity which shares your consciousness, comes from his. He is the foundation of your consciousness. He is not simply your creator that created you from nothing. Because there is nothing. nothing doesn't exist. All there is God, not nothing. So God never had nothing. People think that God created everything from nothing. That's completely untrue, because there's no such thing as nothing. What's true is that there is only God. God is everything. He's omnipresent. He's everything and everywhere. That's why we say God is Hamokum, the place, and so on. So therefore, since He's the place, doesn't have a location. It doesn't have a specific area which it occupies. It is not simply a place. It is the place. God is the place. Everything is in Him. So therefore, the concept of nothing doesn't exist, because everything is God. There's no such thing as a place without God. So God did not create you from nothing, because there was no nothing. So where do you come from? The answer is you come from God. In a certain say, in a very mysterious way, which I don't think we will ever understand, God, in a certain sense, allowed you to share a certain aspect of His own consciousness. You know, and this is why you are a subject, the greatest thing that was ever made. So therefore, you have to harmonize with that subject, with the subject of God. And how do you harmonize with Him? Simply by understanding that you come from Him. You are derived from God. And how do you understand this? By sacrificing your core, the fact that you know you exist through yourself, and you sacrifice that truth to the ultimate truth, the absolute truth, that you don't come from simply your core. Your core is not simply outside of everything. Your core is inside God. And therefore, what that generates is a certain experience. And the name of that experience is love. Because what is love? Love is the ability that when you see the person you love, for example, you feel that that person is not outside of you. And that's true love. There's something called that you love another person and that you care for another person. You like another person. But when you're in love with another person, that's much more intense. When you're in love with someone, you see that person as not outside of you, but as part of you. You see, that person is not simply external to you. The person is internal to you. And that's a different form of existence. And when is love created? How is it that you can love someone? How is it that you can see another person as part of you? The answer is that originally you were once one with that person. In other words, what God did, God separated you from that person. In this case, the person is a female, and it's a person that the female that you love. And that person was once united with you in your consciousness. And God then divided you into two people. That's right. Love appears when one person, a duality, really is that one person, and God separated the duality, the person who was united with you into two people. God created a duality from a single individual. Love is the attempt for the duality to recombine and become one again. So that becomes a permanent feeling. The person that you were once united with is once part of you, just like you were once part of her. Really now desires to get together again. There's an innate desire to be one again. And that oneness is called love. So it's quite a miraculous feeling. And it's not only a miraculous feeling, it's an exalted feeling. True love is exalted and one of the most greatest pleasurable feelings, because what love produces is not a pleasure. You know what I mean? What love produces is a joy. The word joy, which is the word simcha, is completely from the word pleasure, which is hanor. It's a completely different feeling. what you have joy is from being united with the one that were once one with you. So this is what God says. You have to surrender to me. You have to surrender your core to me, because that's where it comes from. It comes from me in some way. And if you surrender your core to me, so you will suddenly feel the process of love. And therefore, it will not be a contradiction between the two of us. Even though you are a subject and you know yourself, or at least in the appearances, you know yourself without me, that's not really true. You, as you know yourself, you really are feeling me in you. And that's how you know yourself. And therefore, you can love me. You see it. Because once you are part of me, and that's why that love is attainable. And that's the only way you can remove the contradiction of what? Of two subjects. Because at that time when you love me, you will become part of me. And I will become in a certain way part of you. And that will remove my yichud pressure to annihilate you. So this is where the Midas Hadin comes from. It comes from the ability of you being a subject. And by you reconciling with God, by harmonizing with Him, so that you are not threatened by His existence. God is automatically a threat to you. It wasn't simply the fact that God created you from nothing. It wasn't simply a fact that God created you at all. It's simply the fact that you cannot coexist with Him at all. And the only way you can coexist with Him is by loving Him. And that's why the biggest mitzvah in the Torah is what? You shall love God. So you can ask the question, well, how can I love God? I can't even see Him. I cannot detect Him with any of my five senses. Not only that, when I'm a soul, I cannot detect Him with any of the senses of the soul. So if I cannot even detect Him, how can I love Him? And the answer is, you can detect Him. You know where you detect God, really? You do not detect God with a sensory organ. A sensory organ is only when you detect Him, you detect Him as if He was outside of you. That's the concept of a sensory organ. It's an organ which allows you to detect something outside of you. But you do not detect God like you detect reality. You know, we detect reality as a body of sight, sound, hearing, smell, touch. But you detect God, even the soul cannot detect God except with a sensory organ. And the sensory organ, I will say this, what's the sensory organ of the soul? It's the intellect. And I will explain this at another time. When you conceive of God, that intellect in a spiritual plane is an actual sensory organ. That's right. You don't think of an intellect as a sensory organ. You think it's an organ that simply comprehends reality in terms of its essence and its definitions. But that's not really what it is. The intellect is really the sensory organ of the soul. In other words, when you conceive of God as a concept on a spiritual plane, this is an aspect of a sensory function. We cannot comprehend that. You know, we really don't know what that is until we become souls, until we see ourselves as souls. But that's the sensory organ, really, of the soul, the intellect, in a spiritual way, and so on. But this is the way you know God. But you don't know God through a sense, through an organ of sense, whether it's the sensory organs of the body or it's a sensory organ of your intellect. Neither one of them tells us that God is, and therefore we can love God. So how do we know God? Because we really know God not through our senses. We know God through our consciousness. That's right. We know God through our core, and our core is beyond a sense organ. It's through the very fact that you know yourself. As you know yourself, you automatically know God. God is part of the core of you. that piece of you that you say, I know myself by myself, that by myself is really through myself. Through my inner being, I know God. I sense him through my core, not through a separate sensory organ like the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, and so on, and touching. We know God through our core itself. In the act of knowing myself, I also know God, because we were really unified. Now, how does one achieve that? How does one know someone, detect someone through my core? The only thing I detect through my core is me. In other words, when you close your eyes, who do you know? Well, you know yourself. When you close your eyes and disconnect yourself from reality, the one being you know is yourself, that you are. And then when you suddenly open your eyes and you see reality, you know reality as something outside of you. How? Through sensory organs. So to know something outside of you, you actually use an organ. But to know yourself, you simply close your eyes and you feel your self-awareness. And in that feeling of self-awareness, you feel that you exist. So the knowledge of yourself comes from the knowledge of yourself, the core of you feel through your consciousness. You connect yourself to your consciousness and you feel that. But to know anything in reality, you have to use a sensory organ. So therefore, fundamentally in Olam Haba, how will we know God? Will we not know God through what? Through some kind of sensory organ? We will know God through the knowledge and the self-awareness of self. Now that's amazing. I can just describe it with words, but I can't replicate the experience of that. Someday all of us will have this experience, and this is the experience of Olam Haba. And when we see the knowledge of God through the knowledge of ourself, this is the most exalted form of knowledge. The most exalted form of knowledge is simply the knowledge of self as self. So therefore, the Midas Hadin, the attribute of justice, is really a determination of how well did you harmonize with God. Because it's necessary to harmonize with God to coexist with him and therefore to love him. So how do we do that? How well have we performed this necessary attachment? So this is what he measures. He measures this in order to determine our ability to exist. So this evaluation of this performance is called din, judgment. And that's why the Midas Hadin is the quality of emes. It's governed by emes. Because the most important emes in all of existence is that two subjects cannot coexist. And we have to get around this emes. And we get around this emes by love. And to the degree that we have achieved this love, to that degree we have accomplished the emes. We have harmonized with emes, and this is the Midas Hadin. Now the question is, how does God evaluate our performance? That's what I really want to speak about. And if you really think about that, you're shocked. It's really shocking how he evaluates your performance. Because God expects you to know two things about him. Right. He expects you to know two things about him. The first thing is called a Muno, and the second thing is called B'tochen. What is a Muno? A Muno is simply the knowledge that God exists. That's number one. That God created the whole universe. God is the center of being of everything that exists. And therefore, we will simply say, you have a Muno that God exists, and God is the creator of everything. He is the power center of everything, because he is the center of the existence of everything. That's called the Muno. And when you believe or not believe, when you feel you know that God exists, that is the center That's the most important thing. And that's called, of course, a Muno. What is betochen? Betochen is simply not the fact only that you know that God exists, but you know that everything he does, whatever he does, is for your benefit. The word betochen means to trust. And you only trust someone when you know that this person likes you and this person is doing everything possible to support your existence. So therefore, this person is said to be very positive for your existence. That's what trust is. We trust someone who we know is for us, supports us, helps us in our existence. And we don't trust someone who's against our existence, who wants to annihilate us or destroy us. So therefore, betochen, which means trust, is simply that we trust that God, whatever he does to us, is really positive, is supporting us, and so on. So that's why we say, command Yovid Rahman Latav. Whatever God does is for the best. In other words, it's really, even though it doesn't appear that way, we know that he's supporting our existence. And therefore we trust him. And that's called betochen. Now the question is, how do we know this? So when we look at things, the question is, does God expect us to believe this? Yes, he expects us. Well, the question is, how does God expect me to believe this? How does God expect me to have a Muno, that we know that he is and that he created everything? He is the power behind everything which exists. And we know that. But we also know that God expects us to trust him, to believe that everything he does to us is fundamentally for our benefit. He expects this from us. And the question is, how can he expect this from us? It's like, that's not really the question. You know, what is easier to get, a Muno or betochen? What is easier, to establish the fact that we understand and we know that he created everything, or the fact that we know that everything he does to us is positive, we can trust him? Which one is easier to obtain? So the answer is, the one that's easier to obtain is the one that we know that he exists. It's not so easy to know that everything he does is for our benefit. Why? Because life includes the concept of pain. Many times there are things which cause us pain. And we say that anything which causes us pain is evil, is ra. So therefore, when we look at the deeds of what God does, we see deeds that are both good and evil. There are deeds that he does to us. There are things that happen to us. There are events which happen to us that are good. We feel pleasure, or else we feel joy. So this is good. But we know that there are things, that events that happens to us quite frequently, unfortunately, that causes us pain. And we say that pain is evil. I don't like it. It completely undermines my existence. So therefore we see that the events in the world are determined and described as good and evil. So we say, how can God do both of them? The essence of God, the essence of his power, means that God is good and only good. God is only a giver, and giving is the act of what? Of doing something good. Taking, which is the opposite of giving, is an act of evil. Because any acting of taking, in a certain sense, jeopardizes. It's what causes pain. What is pain, really? Pain is the experience of taking. Somebody is taking away our ability to exist. If something interferes with your ability to exist, that's called pain. You experience pain. And if someone experiences something which is a giving action, that's called good. So God is really not capable of pain. Or else why would he create us? And there are many things that happen in our life which are good. But how do you reconcile one God that does what? That does good and that does bad. That's called betochen. Because we're really supposed to believe that there's only one kind of action which God does, and that's good. So when we see that God is doing something painful to us, we realize a shocking fact that what? When God is doing something good to us, you see it, we know that it's good because it gives us pleasure or joy. And we can see it. We can see the action, what it causes in us. But if God is doing something bad to us, when we feel pain, we realize that's not evil. Evil, we call evil an action where God is taking something from us, which means he's causing pain. But it's not really evil. What is it? It's simply invisible good. That's what it is. So God can only do two actions. Visible good, where we can see the good in it, we can feel the good, or invisible good, where we cannot see the good. But in reality, the actual essence of it is good. In the end, we will benefit from it. Even though God has to take from us, in some way he's taking from us something which can deter our existence. So God takes it to save us. We don't understand it, and we can't feel this, and we can't see this. So therefore we see this taking action, something that detracts from our existence by taking. We feel pain from it, but it's not pain. It's God saving us. So therefore all pain comes from a taking experience where God is taking away something which threatens our existence. So the question is, well, so is it good or bad? So the answer is, it's really good, because the ultimate purpose of it is to save us, is to relieve us from the possibility of non-existence. So therefore it's really good, but it doesn't feel good. So this is the concept of sweet and good. What is the difference between something which is sweet and something which is good? Something is good if the ultimate outcome of the action or the event is positive, will result in something called the increase in the way we exist. So if the end of the action is that we will exist, we say that it's good. But how it feels depends on what it feels like. So therefore we said if it feels good, we say it's sweet. Sweet applies to how it feels, not what it does. What it does refers to the ultimate conclusion. It's sweet, or it's sour, it's bitter. So the experience of an event is either sweet or bitter. But this has nothing to do with the ultimate outcome of the event. It only has to do with the way we experience it. So we can either experience a sweet event and something which in the end is good, or we can experience a bitter event so that there's pain with it. It's an act of taking, but in the end, it's good. So therefore, what we see, what this one God does is fundamentally what? Is fundamentally good. That's the thing. It says, God only does good as an outcome, but God doesn't necessarily do good as an experience. We may not experience the good, but the ultimate outcome will always be good because it promotes our existence. But in the act of feeling it, in the act of experiencing it, we feel pain. And we call that what we call fundamentally invisible good, what we call good that we cannot see, we call that evil. But what we're really calling evil is the experience of it. It's not the outcome. So the experience is bitter, and we feel pain, but the outcome is good. So we have to realize that God does nothing that has a bad outcome. God is not evil, has no shaykhs to evil. He only has shaykhs to good. But that good can either be experienced in a sweet way, where we like it, or it can be experienced in a bad way, and we call that evil. So this is the definition of what's going on. But how do we know that God is doing something good? How do we know? What tells us that God is only good in its outcome, even though he doesn't feel good in its experience? And that's the importance of Yichud Hashem. Why is the Torah so occupies itself with the concept of Yichud, oneness? Why does the Torah occupy itself by having us declare his unity? Why do we have to believe that there's one God? What is God doing by saying, why is the essence of Judaism, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, there is one God? If God is good, why don't we say that there's one God who's good? Why don't we emphasize his goodness? Why isn't this the center of how we have to believe in God, that fundamentally is good? We don't see that. Because we see that goodness is a concept of betochen. You know? And that's not the only thing we have to acquire. But why is that? Why doesn't God want us to understand his goodness? Why does he want us to understand his unity? That's the question. Because the answer is a very subtle answer. Because we can only believe that God is always good. How? In the Persian religion called Zoroastrianism, they believed that all good things come from a certain God. I forget his name. I think they called his God Ahriman or Ahura Mazda. I forget his name. But all evil events come from another God who is responsible for evil. So therefore, since sweet and bitter is experienced two different types of events, the Persians felt that it was caused by two different gods with a different nature. So they explained the performance of these two events, good and evil, by two different gods. But if you say God is one, then you're going to have a problem. Because if God is one, how can he do good and evil at the same time? It doesn't make sense. A God which does good does not do evil, and a God which does evil does not do good. That's like a multiple personality, and God is not a multiple personality. So therefore, the Baruch Shem says the most important belief that you have to have is in my unity. There is only one God, and I am that God, and I only have one thing. Either I do good or I do evil, and I can promise you I do good. That's why you feel in life the goodness. When you look at the universe, you see what the universe gives you, and that's good. So therefore, why does evil occur? Well, the answer is evil occurs not because it's evil, not because I want to give you pain. Evil occurs because it is invisible good. Because for some reason that you have done, I have to take away the possibility of what? Of you doing something which detracts from your existence. And I have to take that away. In all taking experiences, you feel in pain. When God is taking away something from you that you need, you feel pain. But God is saying, I'm taking that away. Why? Because I want to save you. I want to allow you to exist. That's the reason. So I don't take things from you that you need for your existence because I want to do evil to you. I want to leave you annihilated. That's not why I do it. I'm doing it because I'm doing good for you, because I'm saving you. I'm relieving you of something which will detract from your ability to exist. So therefore, the only thing that I do, because I am one God, is either I do good, which is visible, and that will be sweet. And sometimes I have to do good, which is invisible. And you call that bad or evil. But I call that invisible good. And what supports that belief? What supports that belief is oneness of God. That's why we are so obsessed with his oneness. Because when there's one God, there's only a God who does good. And even though we can't see it, that's what he's doing. But if there are two gods, we can understand. One is doing good and one is doing evil. The God says that's impossible. There is nothing outside of me. I am so one. My oneness is not only the fact that I am one God, but the fact is that there's nothing outside of me. There's no possibility of the number two. Enoid. There is nothing else. So my unity is so magnificent. It is so incredibly awesome that I'm not only one entity, but there's no other entity besides me. and therefore I am always alone, and I am always good. I always do the same thing. When I want to give a benefit, it's forever, and it is total. Because why? I am one God. There are no two gods doing two different actions. There is only one God, and that one God does only one action, which is his nature in a certain sense. So we say that God's nature is Tov Yametiv. God is good, and he what? And he does good, and that's all he is. He is nothing but goodness. But that goodness is achieved through sweet means, where you feel it, and therefore it's sweet, or you don't feel it, you feel pain, or it's bitter. But in either case, it is always good. And that's why God, the Torah, is so obsessed with his unity. It's not so much obsessed with his Tov. It's obsessed with the reason why we believe that he's Tov. Because he is one God, not two, with two different actions, but one God with only one action, good. But that good is either visible or invisible. Now that we understand this, the question is, how does God really see us? How does he relate to us? And the truth of the matter is, God is absolutely shocked. Why? Why is God shocked? Because in a certain sense, God does not understand how we act. How does God demonstrate a Muno? How can we believe that there is a God who created the universe? Which means that it's not random. The universe did not create itself or did not appear by itself. Science has a very big problem with God, because science admits that the universe comes from a big bang. There was once one universe that suddenly expanded. But science cannot explain where the substance or the material of the big bang started. They have no idea how it started. They have some idea how it exposed itself and how it exhibited itself, but they have no idea where it began or how it began. And they question the existence of a creator. But God says, of course you should know that I made it. Why? Because he says there's one word which will tell you there is one quality of all existence that I have implanted in the entire physical universe, in the entire spiritual universe, in everything that I make. There's one word that describes it all and shows you that I am God and I am the author of all creation. And what is that word? What is the word that demonstrates this truth and therefore demonstrates the fact that God expects you to know that he is the creator? God has no expectation that you will deny his existence, because God has said, I have placed something in existence that demonstrates I am the creator. And what is that word? And that word is design. What does it mean, design? It means that every component of an object or everything in the object meets one theme and has one purpose. That every object is kind of an organism. And what is an organism? An organism is an entity which has separate parts which could co-function. The human body, it's composed of different organs, but all of the organs serve one purpose: to allow the person to survive, to allow the person to exist. And every organ has a different sub-function which permits that. And there's a tremendous harmony between all the separate organs in the body. That's incredible. God says there is nothing in existence, nothing that doesn't have the concept of design. And everything in existence is really an organism with separate parts working together as a team towards one specific goal. And if you will look at everything that I created, every animal, every human, every plant, everything and every structure in the universe, you will see that it's fundamentally an organism. Because and so on, it functions according to certain laws. It functions according to basic concept. There is one theme which all the separate parts of that organism contribute to. That's how you know that I am. Because design is not a function. It's not a characteristic which suddenly appears by itself. If you see something is designed, you know that it was made by an intellect. You don't know that it was made by a mind that designed it. Design does not appear randomly. Design does not appear by itself. It only appears by what? Design is a property that indicates the existence of what? That's the question. The answer is a subject, a being with intelligence, with purpose. You see. And therefore, the whole universe indicates me. The one theme of the entire universe indicates that I am. I am the creator and I exist. And everything is subject to design and so on. And this is my signature. In other words, when I created the world, when I created the physical universe, I created the spiritual universe, everything that I created has this concept of design, where everything is harmonized and fits together. And this is my signature on creation. So therefore, I expect you, when you look at my universe and you study, when you study everything in life, that you're seeing design and that you know that I am and that I created it. That you know the existence of a subject, not an object. So, for example, where do we see design? Well, I'll give you an example. A mosquito, the tiny little insect called the mosquito, indicates the existence of God. How? How do you see that? Because a mosquito fundamentally draws blood from a victim and eats that blood, and that's how it eats. The food of a mosquito is blood. So in order for a mosquito to live, it must drink blood. So what does it do? It lands on the human, let's say a human or the animal, whatever it does. It lands on it, and in such a way where the person does not feel the presence of the mosquito on him, and so on. And it puts the nose of the mosquito, which is in the form of, it's called a proboscis, and it's like a long needle-like nose. And it puts that nose into the skin and punctures the skin. And then it punctures the skin so that it gets down to an artery or something like that, and it starts to draw the blood up from the skin into its body. So the mosquito feeds on a person's blood by puncturing the skin and drawing blood from his body. Okay, so that sounds good. Why does that indicate the existence of God? Where do you see the principle of design? Because the mosquito suddenly feels a problem. Why? Because we know that when blood leaves the body, it just doesn't leave. The blood does not simply go out. It clots. That's right. The blood suddenly solidifies in a certain way and therefore prevents the blood from leaving the body. Normally, when the skin is breached, the blood must clot to stop the bleeding. So now we have a problem. How can the mosquito drink blood, you see, from the human that it's on? Because the blood is going to clot from the opening in the skin. And eventually, it clots very quickly. So the mosquito will never be able to finish its meal by drinking the blood. So therefore, how can the mosquito survive? Its food supply is hidden. It's concealed by the process of clotting. So that's a fundamental problem. The problem for the mosquito is how to get its food. So the answer is astonishing, because the mosquito has a certain chemical inside the proboscis or somewhere in its body. That's right. There's a certain chemical when it comes out of the mosquito and goes into your blood. it's actually able to prevent the blood from clotting. That's right. It has what's called an anticoagulant chemical, which prevents the blood from clotting. Wow. So since it prevents your blood from clotting, it's able to feed. Now, this chemical is a very complex biochemical. It's not easy because clotting is a very mysterious process. It's a very deep process. You need certain chemicals like fibrinogen and so on and so forth. It's a complete process in order to clot the blood. So the mosquito is able to produce a chemical which prevents the blood from clotting and therefore allows the mosquito to survive. Well, the question is, how did the mosquito figure this out? How did the mosquito actually figure out this concept of the anticoagulant? The greatest scientists in the world don't even understand truly how the thing is clots. But once they understand somewhat to a degree, and they marvel at its chemistry. They marvel at its design. So how did the mosquito have the ability, the intellect, to figure out how to design a chemical which can prevent the blood from clotting so that it can survive? Is this automatic? Is this spontaneous? Does a mosquito come with this information? Of course not. A mosquito does not have an intellect. It's an insect, nothing. So how does that have the equipment where it could prevent the blood from clotting? And the answer is God. Because God designed the mosquito for different reasons. And in the mosquito, he presented it with a certain chemical that would allow it to survive. There you see design, which is incredible. The very fact that a mosquito can drink your blood without clotting is itself the greatest sign that God created the mosquito. And just as God created the mosquito with all the equipment that it needs, all the processes that it needs to survive, that's how he created everything. Take, for example, the human body. How do you see? You see with your eyes. What you really see is with your retina, the tissue behind the eyes. Now, what your eyes do, light comes from a certain body. It shines or reflects from a certain body, and the light from that body goes into your eyes, and it goes onto your retina. And then your retina converts that light into electrochemical impulses and sends it up your optic nerve to your brain. And then your brain produces a photograph that's called sight. But wait a minute. How does the retina do that? How does the retina take light and convert it to electrochemical signals where your mind actually produces an image? That's incredible. And how many cells are in your retina? Well, scientists estimate that in order to create one image, just one image in your mind, there are 100 million cells in your retina. What? That's right. The ability to create, an image requires 100 million sub-images that all come together in terms of one image. Well, how does the body manage 100 million employees? Imagine if you had a corporation with 100 million workers. How do you manage that? How do you control that? An employee workforce. So the body has to control that. It has to control all those cells so they work together as a team. And from that team of 100 million different segments, they produce one image. Now, is that not design? Doesn't it sound like somebody designed that? Somebody created an organ which actually can function that way? And that's true of every organ in the body. Every organ in the human body is astounding in terms of its chemistry. There was a fellow named Crick who was one of the people that discovered the structure of DNA. And even though he discovered the structure of DNA, that it's a kind of a staircase type of structure, and he suddenly understood how DNA is able to replicate every organ and every cell in the body. He still did not believe in God, even though he saw the most intricate design possible, that a one-celled feature could contain every characteristic in a human being in the size of a cell, or even smaller than a cell, the cell of the nucleus of a cell. And yet he was looking at such a complex thing and the way it was structured, and he was still able to deny that God exists. Well, this man is a scientist, but this man is an absolute fool. Because how could you deny the existence of a creator when you're looking at something which was created? In other words, if you see a work of art, or you see a machine in the desert, and you look at the machine and you see that it works, that it does some function, do you assume that that machine was put there by itself? That randomly all the parts of the machine got together and suddenly create that function? Of course not. That's ridiculous. If you see a typewriter in the desert, you know that someone put it there, and that someone is a subject with an intellect that is capable of making a design. Do you see that that entity has a design on its own? Somebody once said, and I think it was one of the Huxleys, he once said, to believe in evolution is believing that if you have a junkyard which has many, many different components, a huge junkyard, and suddenly a tornado appeared and went through the junkyard. From that tornado, suddenly after the tornado left the junkyard, what appeared as an outcome was a Boeing 747. If I told you such a story, you would laugh at me. You would say it's impossible for a tornado going through a junkyard to produce as a result a Boeing 747 or any kind of machine. Why? Because a tornado is a haphazard storm. You know, it's simply a powerful force. It doesn't have a design. So how could it produce a Boeing 747, which is the most intricate design? It's a machine that can fly. Of course it's impossible. But that's what the theory of evolution fundamentally is. And therefore scientists who believe in the theory of evolution and the whole biology of evolution are not simply scientists. They are scientists who are fools. So God is absolutely astonished. He's astonished that even though design is all over the universe and everything in the universe, there are millions and millions of species of insects. Biologists estimate that there are 2 million species of insects, each one with a different body, each one with a different mind, each one a different series of insects. And such a thing is impossible by random events. So that's what God said. I expect you to believe in me. How? Because of the concept of design. When something is designed, where all the components submit to one theme, one purpose, one function, that can only be created by an intellect. And an intellect is somewhat the definition of a subject. So God expects a person to have a Muno because God gave a person an intellect. And the person, if he thinks clearly and if he's willing to admit it, even if he has a corrupt ego, there is absolute design. So you must believe in the existence of God. It lies, the signature of his existence lies in the universe itself. So therefore, Muno is considered a necessary belief of the person. God is shocked that there are many people who don't believe in him. But the reason why they don't believe in it is that they don't, it's not that they dispute the concept of design. They, of course, they understand something which has such intricate design. So why are there atheists? Why are there agnostics? Why are so many people absolute fools when it comes to the existence of God? And the answer is because of the existence of good and evil. They say that if someone made the universe and conducts the laws of the universe, he would not be someone who does good and evil. So the reason, that's what the Gemara says, less din v'less dayan, that there is no judge. Why? Because there is no justice. Because people, when they look at the world and the events that happen to them, they don't see justice. Because it's what? Because it's invisible. That's why. And because people don't see justice, They don't see why when they do something good, suddenly they feel pain, or they do something bad, they suddenly feel pleasure. It doesn't make sense to them. When they look at their life, it does not make any pleasure. It does not make any sense. So they say, because there is no judge, there's no justice, therefore they say it's probably the fact that there is no creator. So the difficulty in believing in the betochen of God, in trusting him, is what creates the resistance to believing that he exists and creates the universe. It's not the other way around. Every human being who is created on earth, who has an intellect, a functioning intellect, knows that God exists, knows that God created the world. But the reason why he doesn't believe why he believes in the possibility that this world comes by itself, which is absolutely impossible given the design of the world, because he sees the existence of what's good and evil. And therefore he says, well, one thing indicates that God exists, design. But there's something which indicates that God doesn't exist, the fact that it's good and evil events. So because I can't have the tochen in God, I therefore believe that God is a boirei, God is a creator. So because of the difficulty in believing in the tochen, there's a difficulty in believing in a Muno. The inability to believe that God is true judge. And like it says, nothing is done without a purpose and without a reason. Nothing is done in this way. Therefore, because I cannot understand the system of justice that God employs, I therefore say that probably God does not exist. But only a fool would think that. Because the answer is because there is one God, and because the Torah keeps on saying the concept of one God. It's telling you fundamentally that there is only one God and there's only one system, good. But the good that God says is usually visible. Only when good is invisible and results in pain, it results in God trying to save you, do you feel pain. Nothing is random, and that's fundamentally the solution. So God cannot understand the human being, the Zoroastrianism, because design clearly indicates his existence. It's a signature. But there's something that man does that he cannot understand at all. That's right. There's something that the human being does, the Zoroastrianism does, that's completely incomprehensible to God, so to speak. And what is that? Because God looks at the attitude that a human being has to another human being. That's right. Another human, another person. And he sees the cruelties that one person does to another. Like what? Even if he doesn't kill him. Humans constantly kill other humans. There have been more wars in human history than almost anything else. And human beings constantly cause pain. They rob people. They take away their livelihood. Humans humiliate people. They speak lashon hara and rechilas. They constantly treat each other with contempt, with hatred. And God sees this. And this is called sinas chinam, unwarranted hatred. People hate other people and don't like them, not for any reason, not because the other person did something bad to them. They just hate them because they feel superior. In order to feel superior to another person and the need to feel superior, they look down on other people. That's the main way that people feel a sense of superiority. The main way is by acquiring power. And this power makes you feel superior. And every human wants to feel superior to another human so that he has power. So therefore he will look down on people who are a different race, or he will look down on people who are different moral code, or live in a different place. He will always find people to look down on. Why? Because that's the fastest and best way to believe in yourself as a powerful person. And everyone wants power. That's the fundamental basis of human behavior. They call that ego, but it's really power. We want the power of accomplishment, but what we really want is the power of being, that I am a better person than you. And in the act of that power, people will do anything. What? They will hurt other people. They will give people pain. simply by looking at them with contempt. Every race on earth and every country on earth considers itself more powerful and more useful and more ethical than another. And many times people use religion as a source of power. My religion is better than your religion. You know what I mean? And therefore, so forth, in that way. So therefore, people always get power by looking down at other people. And God says the following: I don't understand this. Why? Because if you know that I am the creator of everything, I am the creator of two people. I've made both of you. And therefore, since I alone have made both of you two people, right? You two people are my sons. Whoever I made is considered like my son. And therefore, since you two people were created by me as your father, this other person is your brother. This other woman is your sister. So therefore, every human on earth is your brother and sister, period. There's no other explanation. Because God is the Father of all men, of everyone. So God does not understand. Don't you realize that? Don't you realize that I created all of you, and therefore all of you are my children? And therefore all of you are like a family. You're all brothers and sisters. So do you think that I created people differently? Of course not. I wouldn't do that. So why do you treat yourselves differently? Why does each one of you want to be more superior than the other? Why does each one of you always look to gain power over another? Power by taking another people's money. Power by taking their livelihoods. Power by killing them or going to war and so on. Power in treating other people with contempt. Why is there so much lashon hara in the world? So, would you speak lashon hara on your own brother and sister? Of course not. Somebody is in your family, you would never speak lashon hara. You would never forcefully and purposely want to hurt them and harm them. But people constantly speak calumny, constantly speak slander, constantly speak lashon hara and mechilas. Why? It doesn't make sense. You're speaking this thing continuously as a form of hatred, unwanted hatred. The biggest manifestation of what? Of lashon hara and mechilas, sinas chinam, unwanted hatred, is the contempt you have for each other. And do you think that I want this? You think this is what I want? You think I want you to hate your brother and your sister? You people are crazy. You are all my family, and I cannot understand why you treat each other with such contempt. And this enrages God. It enrages him like nothing that you've ever seen. In fact, this is the main downfall of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are the elite in the sense that their purpose is elite. The Jewish people their purpose is to give mankind the belief in God and his goodness. That's what the purpose of the Jewish people, and in that sense, they're called the chosen people. They're only chosen for a specific purpose. They're not chosen because necessarily better than anyone else. They're chosen because of certain things that they did. They're chosen because of their deeds. And because of their deeds, God shows them to be a model, to be an example for all of mankind, how to treat each other. And what do Jews do? Do they treat each other well? Of course not. There's a tremendous amount of sinas chinam. In fact, in your whole life, how much lashon hara, slander, contempt, humiliation do you say? And so on. So therefore, the Jewish people completely betray their essential purpose. And their essential purpose is to convey the fact, the unity of God and the unity of all of mankind. And God is enraged at that betrayal. And when he sees that, he says, I don't want to have anything to do with you. That's why God destroyed the temple and exiled all the Jews for the last 2,000 years. Why? Because they have betrayed their kedusha, their sanctity. Why? Because of their contempt for each other. And this is something that God cannot comprehend. So this is something that God does not understand, really. That the fact that mankind is made from the same Father, and therefore our brothers and sisters should be treated with such contempt and humiliation and such robbery and homicide. So that explains why the Jewish people, even though they are the highest of people and they have the most spirituality, are in such a desperate state. The Jews will always be in a desperate state were it not for God's mercy, because of the way they treat each other. There's no way around it. You can convince yourself that you are superior because you think that you do religion better, or you do no more than another person, or you're wealthier than another person, or you're more powerful than another person. That is untrue. Fundamentally, God judges the disunity and the contempt that human beings have for each other, especially the contempt that Jews have for each other. And he will say, now that you have this contempt, I will treat you in a subsidiary fashion. Even though you are the highest of men in a certain way because of your purpose and your deeds, not because of your innate superiority, because of what you've done. You have earned a certain place. But I will not treat you according to that level. And I will exile you, and I will leave you, and I will betray. But through my mercy, I will have to exhibit a lot of evil to you. You will have to suffer greatly throughout your history. Why? To cleanse you from your contempt and your hatred of another Jew. And the Jews don't understand this. They don't understand that they are the cause of their own troubles, their own pain. They are their worst enemy. And this is the main lesson that they have to learn. Otherwise, God has to put them through tremendous pain and suffering. So this is the concept. This is a very important concept, how God fails to understand the way people treat each other. Not only Jews to Jews, but Jews to the Gentiles, Jews to non-Jews. Even non-Jews deserve tremendous recognition that they're human, they have intellects, they have souls. They are the creation of God, and God still has a purpose for them. And God still wants them to share in some way Olam Haba. And a goy who's worthy does go to Olam Haba. Maybe not the same Olam Haba as a Jew, but he goes to Olam Haba. And this is a very important truth. So therefore we see the two main things of the Midas Hadin. The attribute of justice judges men on two main ways. The two biggest sins of all. The sin of Muno and the sin of Achdus. That even those people see tremendous design in everything in creation, they still don't believe in God. They still do not accept this concept of invisible good, and God is really saving you. And the second thing, which is the biggest sin of all, is the lack of achdus of the human race and of the Jewish people amongst themselves. That they do not treat each other with tremendous respect, sincere respect. They may do good things to impress other people and to indicate that they are good people, but many times this is simply to make an impression. This is not from their hearts. And these are the two greatest sins of all. And the attribute of justice is very strong when it comes to this. So how does God save people from the attribute of justice? So we see that the attribute of justice is triggered by two things. By the yukut pressure of God, that man has to harmonize with God. You see, in order to allow him to coexist with God. And we see by the fact that mankind is what? Is terrible. Terrible to God in the sense that they deny him recognition that he is the sponsor and the author of creation. And this is a terrible thing itself. Imagine God creating all of reality and you saying it's random. It's not coming from God. There is no God. This is complete contempt for the author and creator of the universe. And then finally, the way we treat each other. One is bein adam lamokum, between man and God, and the way we treat each other between man and man, that all of us fundamentally have contempt for other people, when really other people are our brothers and sisters, especially Jews. So how does God save the world? How does he do it? So the answer is with the attribute of justice. With the attribute of mercy. God is a Malachim. God has the attribute of mercy. And because of the attribute of mercy, God is willing to suspend the tenets of justice. He's willing to allow people to survive even the sins that they do. And eventually, through the application of invisible good, which is called pain, he hopes to redeem mankind. But the question that we have to ask is really this. Where does the attribute of mercy come from? Where does the attribute of mercy come from? We understand where the attribute of judgment comes from. But where does the attribute of mercy come from? Why is God merciful? If justice is so important, because you have to harmonize with God to coexist with him, where does the attribute of mercy come from? So we say, one possible answer is we say that what? God is fundamentally a father. And a father is merciful to his children, right? Because a father loves his children. A king doesn't love his subjects. He simply wants to maintain his subjects that they behave according to justice. But a father loves his children, and therefore a father wants them to survive. A father wants a son to survive, even though his son is not a good person. No father can witness the annihilation or death of a son easily, So that's what they say. They say, therefore, that explains how God sees people, and that's why he has mercy, because he's like a father. And what I say, that's not true at all. God is a father, he's a creator, but he's not like a human father. Why? Because a human father is destined to have children. He's destined to have extensions of himself. A father and mother are destined to be a father and mother through their ability to reproduce. That's a natural consequence. So therefore, a son and a daughter are normal extensions of what a father and mother are. That's what's natural, and that makes sense. If I produce a son or a daughter, of course I'm going to love them because they are extensions of my being. So of course I'm going to love them. But God is different. We are not, in a certain sense, God's true children. Why? Because God has no children. I mean, God has nothing outside of him. So God is a completely kind of being than us. We are not simply people who have extensions, who have what's called in Hebrew toldos, who have derivatives. Derivatives are natural for us. We have extensions to our life. We have children, and they have children. But God, in a natural way, has nothing to do with children. He has nothing to do with anything which is outside of him. He is existence. Existence emanates from him, and therefore nothing can exist besides him. So therefore, in a way, he does act like a father. Yes, we say this. We try and understand his goodness through this principle. But in reality, this principle is not operational. It doesn't explain truly the origin of mercy. Because even though we say what? God is just. Why? Because God is emes, he's truth. Justice comes from truth. Where does mercy come from? Mercy comes from love. Because God loves us, he has mercy. But the truth of the matter is that really the absolute origin of mercy? And I would say, no, it isn't. I would say mercy comes from a completely different place. And where is that place? Why is God merciful to the people he created? Why? Because he created them? No, he didn't have to create them. God needs to be alone. That's his nature. He didn't have to create anyone. So God is not a normal father in the sense. So then where does God develop this love in a certain sense? So the truth of the matter is, the true answer to this is we don't know. We don't know really ultimately why God created human beings. We say that God is good, and therefore a good being wants to do good, and to do good means to support one's existence. That's true. But God is not really good. God has nothing to do with a relationship. God doesn't have a relationship. God can't have a relationship. That's why God created the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is simply a suit that God wears, and through that suit, he creates mankind. But God himself is absolutely alone. So in that case, could people make sure that there's no sound coming from him?
Yeah.
So the real question is, where does God develop this love? So it's not love, really, which does it. True mercy does not come from love. True mercy comes from something, another place. Because fundamentally, this is the truth of what I think is the truth. A person can say to God in a conversation with God, yes, it's true, I am an evil person, I am a Russia. Yes, I have done evil things. One of the things I have done against you, I refuse to recognize that you have created the universe. You refuse to recognize that through design, you are the absolute creator of all reality. And the second evil thing that I've done is that I have really harmed another person. I have harmed another person who's actually my brother and sister, who I should really love and I should, in a certain sense, feel a unity to. And I have done evil things to him. So I have done evil. That's true. So the person says, therefore, I have acted evilly. And therefore, that's why I understand your justice. But the question is, why does God want to save me? And the answer is simply this. Because God, you can say to God, and every person can really turn to God and really say this. It's true, I have acted evilly in terms of my behavior. But you, in a certain sense, have assisted me in this. Why? Because you have made it possible for me to be an evil person. That's right. And it's because of your program that you wanted to create me and that you wanted me to survive, even though that is against your yichud. So therefore, you are giving me the free will to choose what I will do. So therefore, it's true that I have acted in an evil way. I have chosen to go in the wrong direction. But you have enabled me. You're an enabler in a certain sense, because you have created that possibility that evil could be done by me. It's true that evil cannot be done by you, because you are only good. But evil could be done by me. You have given me permission to have free will and to determine my own nature in the free will. You have given me the permission to kill another person, to rob another person, to humiliate another person. And even though I really can't do this in an absolute sense, because everyone that I kill, rob, and humiliate deserves it himself, I am simply fulfilling your purpose as a perpetrator. And the victim, there's no such thing as a victim, because every person who feels pain because he deserved it himself. God does not inflict any kind of evil on a person or pain on a person that he himself doesn't deserve it. That's God's action of justice. When we say that God is a true judge, we are saying that nobody gets anything that he doesn't deserve. There's no such thing as a random crime or a random perpetration. Everything that a person has in life is from the person himself. but God has to choose a perpetrator, somebody who's going to do the crime. And for that, God simply looks at people and sees who wants to do it, who wants to benefit from that in some way, in some evil way. And then God puts the perpetrator together with the victim. So the victim only suffers because he deserves to suffer, but the perpetrator is chosen to cause the suffering because he wanted to be chosen to cause suffering. So therefore, the perpetrator will be punished because of his choice, but the victim is punished because of something he did. Every victim did his own crime in a certain way and deserves the pain that he gets. But the perpetrator doesn't have to be a perpetrator. God only chooses perpetrators who want to be perpetrators. So therefore, he himself has to suffer for his own crime. So the crime of a victim is different than the crime of a perpetrator. It's not necessarily related. Although in certain cases they may be, but they're not really related. So the crime of a perpetrator is because he wants to be a perpetrator. The crime of a victim is because he himself did a certain evil that he has to be punished for. But that's because of him. So that's justice. But it doesn't make a difference. Because in any case, push comes to shove, God is an enabler. Because even though I am the person, the perpetrator is the one who does the act of evil. But God is enabled because God allowed evil to survive. You know, he allows pain to survive. He allows evil to survive, meaning he allows the invisible good. And no matter what you say, just to allow invisible good is to enable something which probably should not exist. So in a certain way, God is responsible also. God, in a certain sense, in a minimal sense, tends to be a co-conspirator. You do the evil, but I enable it. So that's what the Gemara means. The Gemara says that on Rosh Chodesh, when you bring certain korbanos, certain sacrifices, and the korban of Rosh Chodesh is also a chatos, a sin offering, and God brings a sin offering. God says to the Jews, you have to sacrifice a sin offering at the temple. And you know what it says? And that sin offering, God says, is for me. That's right. Why? Because I created invisible good. The very fact that I created the possibility of pain, an invisible good, means that I also have to bring a sacrifice. In other words, I take responsibility since I am the center of emes, of truth. I have to take responsibility for what I do, that I didn't do the evil. But in order to restore you and to save you, I have to give you pain, which on a certain level, at least in an apparent way, is evil. So I have to take responsibility for this evil that I am promoting. And this evil is not good. This evil is the invisible good that I do, because the invisible good is painful. And I have to take responsibility. And when I mean the Ein Sof has to take responsibility. This is beyond Atzmusai. This is the province of the Ein Sof, the Ratzon of God, the will of God to create human beings, the Zoroastrianism. And part of the creation of the Ein Sof, part of the development of the Ein Sof from Atzmusai has to do with what God has to do to save mankind from his free choices. And part of that saving mankind is to give him pain or invisible good. But God even has to take responsibility, because he simply allowed, even though it's absolutely necessary for some sense, because the exalted existence of God only allows God to exist and nothing else. So therefore everything must harmonize. So God therefore is compelled in a certain sense to judge you if you harmonize with him. But this is the fact, that because God is solely responsible for enabling the invisible good or the pain, he himself has to make up for it. That's right. God has to make up for this. So on a certain level, on a lower level of Ein Sof, Nalatzmusoi, on a level of Ein Sof, he makes up for it by having Rachamim. That's where Rachamim comes from. It comes from the admission of God that he still has to make up for it. He has to make up for the existence of evil, from enabling the existence of evil, even though God doesn't do evil, because the outcome of all evil is good. So God is not considered having to do evil. But since the experience of evil is painful, he is somewhat, in a certain sense, on the level of, in the Bechina of Ein Sof, on the level of the Ein Sof, that which has no end. He is responsible for the existence of evil. So therefore, God compensates for that existence by being merciful, by giving the human being, the Zulosoi, as much as possible the possibility of surviving the evil and then going to the eternal world of Olam Haba when there's no time, space, or action. Why? He is merciful, and God will be merciful almost to the nth degree, like he says to Moshe Rabbeinu. I will be merciful to who? To the who I will be merciful, which is a synthetic sentence. In other words, God is simply saying, I will be merciful to you. Why? Because I will be merciful to you. There is no conditions. Mercy is on such a level. God has such a level of mercy when it's almost unconditional. God will try and save everybody to go to Olam Haba. Of course, there are certain exceptions. There are human beings who are so evil that they cannot be saved, like a person like Adolf Hitler, or the Nazis, and so on as examples. There are cruel human beings that are killers, and they're genocide. Anyone who conspires to genocide, to kill other human beings, well, of course, what does he have to do with eternity? Nothing. Because that's a level of evil which is completely anti-God. So therefore we see, I believe, what the true origin of mercy is. The origin of mercy is therefore from the attribute of justice. It's the justice that applies to God. Because God is still responsible for invisible good. He's still responsible for pain because he has enabled the whole system. And that's what a person can say to God. Yes, it's true. I do the evil. I do the action. But you enable the possibility. You enable the the possibility of evil in a certain way. And a person has this kind of, not the atzmusai, which we cannot even understand, God as he is in himself, is absolutely incomprehensible. And therefore, when I say this concept of mercy, that it comes from justice, that God has to also make up, he has to compensate for the actual existence of evil, even though he's not responsible for the action of existence, comes from the Ein Sof, comes from a lower level of his malbush, comes from something that he wears, something that's on him. Because in a certain sense, like I've said before, the Ein Sof, which is beyond concept, beyond any logic, is a kind of a suit that God wears to give him a will so that he suddenly can create mankind. So I am not talking about Atzmusai. I am not talking about God as he is himself, which is absolutely incomprehensible. We do not understand really in the end why God created anything outside of him. You know, we do not understand the concept of his Tov and so on. But what we can understand is his will, what he wanted. And since he wanted mankind to love him and to love all men and to love goodness and to love ethics and so on and to love wisdom, you see it. Therefore, he made these things mitzvos, commandments that should determine how a person should act, so that he can earn a state of existence which has all of these things. We do understand this. But the ultimate reason we cannot understand, because we can have no way to understand or comprehend God as he is in himself, the being who exists alone and exists beyond time, space, action, everything, who even exists beyond will. God in himself has no will, because if you are everything, then you don't want anything. Will is a manifestation of want. I want something, that's my will. But if I am everything, I have no will. There's no real manifestation to a perfect being. So this being is beyond our ability to conceive. But it is creation of the Ein Sof. We can see this as understandable in the domain of the Ein Sof, the manifestation of God as he is to us and to the universe and to the spiritual and physical universe and to Olam Haba, the manifestation that God has to the future world beyond time, space, and action, and to the spiritual and physical world, which is part of Olam Hazeh. We can see his relationship, and that relationship is to the feature of will, that he wants something and that he created something from his want. But the concept of will to God himself is beyond comprehension. But it seems to me that the action of mercy comes from really the Midas Hadin. It comes from the attribute of justice, because God is saying to you, yes, you are responsible for the actions of evil, but I am responsible for the existence of that possibility, and therefore I myself will also bring a korban. And that's where mercy comes from, the manifestation of acceptance in a certain sense of the responsibility to this in the level of the Ein Sof is what engenders the concept of a korban chatas and so on. So therefore we see something amazing. Both the attribute of justice and the attribute of mercy comes from the principle of truth. The attribute of justice comes from truth, the truth that two subjects cannot coexist unless they're harmonized. And the attribute of mercy comes from the truth that what? That God at least is responsible for allowing the existence and the possibility of evil, even though he has nothing to do with the action of evil, because everything that God does has a good outcome. It supports existence. It supports eternal existence. But as a concept of what? Of an action that allows the possibility to do evil, God maintains that responsibility and therefore is merciful. He gives every chance to a person to earn the future life in the future eternity. And that's why God is merciful, to disallow the concept of his responsibility for at least creating what's called invisible good. So this is a very deep thing. So justice and mercy both come from truth. In a certain sense, they both come from the attribute of justice itself. So therefore, what I've tried to explain today is what the attribute of justice is. What does it mean, truth? What is the ultimate truth? And I've also tried to explain today why God is merciful, in the same way that all of this emanates from his truth. And this Pesach, I give a blessing that what? That this should be the last Pesach on earth. That the next Pesach that we see should be a Pesach where we have the Mashiach and the Geula, when finally all these tribulations, both good and invisible good, finally come to an end. And everything turns to total good forever and ever. Okay, that's it.
Amen. Amazing share, Shimon. Thank you.
Yes.
So you made a 360 on the Mitzvah dinner, Shimon.
I know. I know.
Wow. I love it.
But I believe this is true. So I've really explained
it.
Yeah, I believe this is the Darkei Hashem, this is the Derech Hashem in its ultimate. The Derech Hashem includes not only din, but it includes rachamim. This is all part of his derech. And it's not that one comes from truth and one comes from love. All of it comes from the statement, Hashem Elokeichem Emes. God is a God of truth. And that truth includes both din and rachamim. Okay, thank you very much.
Shimon, the only question is that without the rotzen, where does the rotzen fit into that? Is that in din or in?
Well, the fundamental rotzen of God is to produce a zulosoi, or a subject that can coexist with him. That's the rotzen. And he has to take care of any deviation that interferes with that. That's it. We have to do the mitzvahs, and he has to give us the mazel. We both have a responsibility. The Ein Sof has a responsibility. And that responsibility is that we survive.
Saying it's not just, I want to make sure I understand you. It's not just his rotzen has to take care of the issue of Nam D'Ksufa. Because it's an emanation of God, it emanates from God, his yichud has to deal with Nam D'Ksufa. Because yichud created that flaw. That's the chiddush that you're saying. Wow.
Well, from the Ein Sof, this is all on the level of Ein Sof.
All from the Ein Sof, understood. We're talking all in Ein Sof, understood. But the emissary of the Ein Sof, that the derivative has a flaw in it, requires him to deal with the issue. Wow.
Yeah, because the fundamental law is two subjects cannot coexist. And you have to understand where that comes from. That comes from the awesome nature of God. That God is totally beyond and outside. He's beyond the number two. There's nothing else besides him. And when we talk about that God, we talk about Atzmusoi. And that God cannot be comprehended in any sense. But in terms of his Malbush, the Ein Sof, that serves as his Ratzon, his will, we can understand that God. And that God is fundamentally, completely defined by truth, by din. Even the mercy of that God is defined by truth in a certain way. So therefore, there's an interaction between the Zulosoi, which is called the Yesof. What is the Zulosoi called, the human being? He's called the Yesof, something that's outside of him and has a boundary. And he's called the Ein Sof, something which has no boundary, which is beyond concept. So in terms of the interaction of the two, Ein Sof and Yesof, the fundamental attribute of functions is emes. That's why it says Hashem Elokeichem emes. It doesn't say Hashem Elokei Ava. It doesn't say that. But his main attribute is emes. And both justice and mercy comes from his emes. And that's the fundamental principles which operate. This is very deep, this whole thing. But I think I've made it understandable.